In a world that worships certainty, we've forgotten the wisdom of doubt. We're taught to be confident, decisive, unwavering. But what if that conviction is the very thing keeping us blind? In this cinematic journey, you'll descend into the depths of Jungian psychology to uncover why unshakable certainty can be a mask for unconscious darkness. You'll discover how the shadow hides behind righteousness, and why true transformation begins not with answers, but with the courage to question everything. Conviction can feel holy. It can feel like standing on sacred ground, firm-footed and unshakable as the winds of doubt and ambiguity swirl around you. To be certain is seductive, because in a world of chaos, certainty offers a throne. It offers power. It offers the illusion of final truth. But Jung warned us, beware the man who is too certain. For the man who clutches to certainty has most often exiled his unconscious. He has buried his shadow. He has denied his inner plurality. Certainty, when worshipped, becomes a curse, a psychic rigidity that blocks transformation, suffocates the soul, and distorts the very truths it claims to protect. The unconscious is not orderly. It is not clean. It is not polite. It is wild, paradoxical, and drenched in symbolic language. When you cling to conviction too tightly, you cease to hear its whispers. You stop dreaming. You stop becoming. You mistake the map for the territory, the image for the reality, the ego for the self. The curse of conviction lies in its blindness. It convinces you that you are awake when you are still asleep, that you are free when you are merely obedient to an inner tyrant. Certainty becomes a mask, a fortress, a hardened shell around a fearful psyche that dare not face the unknown. But to the unconscious, certainty is death. It is the refusal to listen, the refusal to question, the refusal to doubt even the beliefs that shape our identities. And so, the unconscious retaliates. It rebels in dreams, in projections, in sudden bursts of anger or sorrow that seem to come from nowhere. It sends warnings through the cracks in the psyche, the breakdown, the failed relationship, the gnawing anxiety that no affirmation can soothe. These are not signs that something is wrong. They are signs that something is trying to break through. Conviction, when it becomes absolute, kills the capacity for inner dialogue. The inner world is not a courtroom. It is a living mythos. It is not a place for verdicts. It is a place for symbols, for contradictions, for the mystery of archetypes that do not obey reason. The one who walks the path of individuation must make peace with doubt, must kneel before mystery, must hold their beliefs like lanterns, not swords, because the moment you weaponize your truth, it is no longer truth, it is ideology. And ideology is what the shadow uses to justify its violence. This is why the most dangerous people are often the most convinced, not of truth, but of their own righteousness. Their certainty is a defense against their own unconscious, their own unexamined motives. Jung saw this clearly in the horrors of the 20th century, where entire nations fell under the spell of collective certainty, racial certainty, political certainty, religious certainty. But what was repressed in the individual did not vanish. It became the monster of the mob. The denied shadow multiplied across millions, took form in uniforms and flags and genocide. And it began always with certainty, with the belief, I am right, they are wrong, I am light, they are shadow. But the line between good and evil does not run between groups. It runs through the soul of every human being. And the moment you forget this, you fall under the spell. The spell of projection, where what you refuse to face in yourself is seen in the other. This is not morality. It is shadow possession, and it is fed by unshakable conviction. There is a deeper truth. Real wisdom always doubts itself, not because it is weak, but because it is humble before the vastness of the unknown. The wise man does not speak to prove himself right. He speaks to deepen the mystery. He does not wield ideas like weapons. He carries them like sacred seeds, knowing that each one must die before it can bloom. Inner growth demands the death of certainty. It demands the sacrifice of knowing, the letting go of dogma. Only in the silence beyond opinion can the self emerge. This is why the unconscious speaks in dreams, because dreams are not rational. They are not linear, they are mythic. They are the language of the soul, strange, fragmented, symbolic. And they only open themselves to those willing to surrender their certainty and listen with the heart. In a dream, a monster may be your teacher. A snake may be your ally. Your enemy may be your twin. This is the terrain of inner alchemy, where opposites are not enemies, but ingredients for transformation. But the alchemist cannot enter the furnace carrying the weight of fixed belief. He must enter naked, broken. Doubting open conviction will tell you that to change your mind is weakness, that to question your ideology is betrayal. But this is the voice of the ego, afraid of its own death. The ego clings to identity because it fears dissolution, but Jung taught that the path to the self requires the death of the ego's illusions. It requires us to pass through the crucible, to be dismantled by our own unconscious, to let go of the labels we clung to like armor. Only then, when we stand inwardly, naked, trembling, and unsure, can the self emerge. And the self is not an idea. It is a living reality, a center beyond duality, beyond identity, beyond certainty. So ask yourself, where in your life have you mistaken conviction for truth? Where have you silenced your own doubt because it made you uncomfortable? Where have you condemned others? Not because they were wrong, but because they mirrored something you refused to see in yourself. These are not just questions. They are invitations. Invitations to begin the descent, to leave behind the throne of certainty and step into the underworld of the unconscious where the real work begins. The spiritual ego is the most dangerous of all. There is a deception more seductive than power, more blinding than wealth, and more insidious than ignorance. It wears white robes, speaks in gentle tones, and hides behind sacred symbols. It bows in temples, prays with conviction, and quotes scriptures with serene authority. But beneath its calm surface lies the most cunning of all masks, the spiritual ego. It is the ego that has not been dismantled, but disguised, transformed not through humility, but through performance. The self that once craved status now craves enlightenment. The identity that once sought control now seeks transcendence. But it is the same hunger, merely cloaked in divine language. And this is why it is the most dangerous of all, because it believes itself holy, it believes itself awake. And nothing is harder to transform than that which is convinced it is already healed. Carl Jung did not speak of enlightenment as a light-filled escape. He warned us that true spiritual work begins in the shadow, not in the heavens. The unconscious is not reached by climbing, but by descending into the depths of our fears, our wounds, our shame. The one who seeks only the light has already begun to split. They have already disowned the parts of themselves that do not fit the image of the awakened one. And so, the darkness returns, not in awareness, but in projection. The shadow of the spiritual ego is not loud, it is silent, passive, and deadly. It is the judgment hidden behind compassion, the superiority masked as humility, the craving for validation that wears the face of service. There is no shadow more elusive than the one dressed in light. And yet the symbols will always reveal the truth. When the sacred becomes a stage, the symbols become hollow. The cross becomes a prop. The mantra becomes a performance. The silence becomes another tool of avoidance. And in dreams, the unconscious shows the cost. The white-robed figure with no face. The temple collapsing inward, the glowing angel who turns to ash when touched. These are not just dreams. They are warnings. The psyche knows when the soul has been replaced by performance. True spiritual growth is violent, not in the outer world, but within. It shatters illusions. It tears masks from the flesh. It drags the ego down from its throne and strips it of its divinity. There is no enlightenment without crucifixion. There is no transformation without death. The death of the image, the death of certainty, the death of the good person we pretend to be. The spiritual ego avoids this death by pretending it already happened. It quotes wisdom, but does not embody it. It speaks of surrender, but clings tightly to control. It preaches forgiveness while holding itself above those still in shadow. It is not awake. It is asleep beneath a velvet blanket of spiritual identity. Jung spoke of individuation as a sacred process of becoming whole. Not good, not pure, not perfect whole. And wholeness includes the shadow. It includes rage. It includes doubt. It includes the monstrous. To walk this path is not to become angelic. It is to become real. And in reality, there is pain. There is contradiction, there is sacred filth. The alchemist knew this, that gold is forged, not in purity, but in fire. That lead the dull, the rejected, the base is the starting point of inner transformation. The spiritual ego skips this. It wants the gold without the furnace. It wants the crown without the descent. But the descent is not optional. The unconscious will not be bypassed. It will make itself known in dreams, in breakdowns, in failed relationships, in the quiet terror that haunts the most peaceful face. The more you pretend to be above the world, the more violently the world will remind you that you are not. The more you deny your shadow, the more it will possess you. It will speak through you in moments of righteousness. It will act through you in your mission to heal others. It will guide your hand as you condemn. Convert correct. And all the while you will believe you are helping. You will believe you are good. That is its final trick, to act through you while you still believe you are acting from love. There is a silence deeper than meditation. It is the silence that comes when the mask is gone, when the performance ends, when the self falls to its knees in the presence of what it cannot control. This silence is not peaceful. It is terrifying, because it strips away every idea you had of yourself. And it is only here in this dark humility that true spirituality begins, when the ego admits it knows nothing, when the seeker stops seeking, when the savior realizes they too need saving. Only then can the archetypes descend, and only then does the inner teacher arrive. Not the outer image of a guru or guide, but the living self, the mystery, the fire, and the still voice that speaks from the core of the psyche. The self is not impressed by your spiritual titles. It does not care about your following, your lineage, your rituals. It sees through all masks. It waits behind the curtain, behind the performance, behind the persona of the light bringer. It waits with infinite patience, knowing that sooner or later the mask will crack, the illusion will fail. And in that breaking the real begins. You do not meet the self by ascending. You meet the self by breaking, by bleeding, by standing in the ruins of who you thought you were, and daring to ask, who am I truly beneath all this? When conviction becomes a curse, Jung's warning on certainty. Conviction in its purest form is meant to anchor us, to tether the drifting mind to something firm, to offer structure where there is chaos, to give meaning to a life otherwise overwhelmed by questions. But what begins as clarity can easily calcify into dogma. What once served the soul becomes its prison. Certainty, when left unexamined, becomes a shell shiny on the outside, hollow within. Jung warned not of the absence of belief, but a belief so rigid it chokes the unconscious. The one who never questions their truth has already begun to rot from within. For the psyche is not a fixed cathedral. It is a living forest, always growing, always dying, always shifting form. And those who try to nail it down, to define it once and for all, commit a subtle kind of violence. They betray the very soul they claim to serve. There is a shadow lurking behind certainty. It is not always dark or loud. Often it appears as righteousness, as moral clarity, as unshakable faith. But its tone is brittle. Its gaze is narrow. It does not listen. It does not question it. Declares, and in declaring it, silences the deep, because the unconscious does not speak in conclusions. It speaks in symbols, in paradox. In dreams, where the villain is the hero, where the fall is the awakening, where the end is a disguised beginning. Those who cannot hold paradox cannot hear the voice of the unconscious. And those who cannot doubt themselves cannot grow. The one who is too certain has stopped becoming. And in Jungian terms, to stop becoming is to die before you are born. An individuation. The process by which one becomes a whole self is not a destination. It is a spiral descent into the unknown. A confrontation with shadow after shadow. Layer after layer of the false self, and this requires doubt. Not the doubt of despair, but the sacred doubt that humbles the ego. The kind of doubt that kneels before mystery and says, I do not know. Teach me. The kind of doubt that breaks open the shell of certainty and lets the deeper self speak. We are creatures of myth. Even now, in an age of data and precision, we hunger for meaning. But when we lose contact with the mythic dimension of life, we replace it with ideology. And ideology is myth without soul. It is myth stripped of ambiguity. It is the hero's journey rewritten to exclude the descent in the shadow, the feminine. It is a clean narrative, a sanitized truth, a weaponized morality. Jung saw this in the rise of totalitarian regimes, in the fanatical movements of the 20th century that promised salvation while silencing the individual psyche. But the same dynamic plays out today, in the spiritual echo chambers, in the political certainties, in the self-help dogmas that sell healing like a product. And always the same curse, the replacement of inner transformation with outer conformity. Conviction is not wrong, but when it becomes a defense against the unconscious, it hardens the soul. It creates a mask, so complete, so convincing, that even the wearer forgets it is a mask. You speak not from your depth, but from your persona, from the part of you that knows how to be admired, how to be correct, how to win. But the self does not care about winning. The self cares about wholeness, and wholeness demands contradiction. It demands that you carry your light and your darkness in the same hands, that you speak truth while knowing you are always partly blind, that you walk forward even as the ground beneath you shifts with every step. Jung understood that the psyche is not a machine, it is a mystery. And to navigate it requires reverence, not certainty. The dream is not a puzzle to solve, it is a voice to honor. The symbol is not a code to crack, it is a mirror of the soul. Those who walk the path of inner work must give up the desire to be right. They must be willing to be undone. Again and again, they must let go of the convictions that once saved them, because what saves you at one stage of growth can destroy you at the next. This is the law of transformation. What was true must die for a deeper truth to emerge. And this death is not metaphor. It is psychic. It is the dismemberment of the old identity, the breaking apart of the self you thought you were. It is terrifying, and that is why so many avoid it. They cling to belief like a lifeboat, even as the sea of the soul rises to swallow them whole. But the soul does not punish. It invites. It waits. It whispers in symbols in sickness, in suffering. It sends messages through the body, through dreams, through patterns that repeat, until we finally turn inward and ask, what have I not yet faced in myself? This is the beginning of true conviction, not the conviction of ideology, but the conviction of humility. The conviction that you are a mystery to yourself, that your work is not to be certain, but to be present, to hold space for the unknown, to make your life a ritual of listening to the dreams, to the archetypes, to the still small voice that lives beneath the noise. This is not weakness. This is inner sovereignty, and the willingness to be dismantled by the truth, the strength to carry doubt without losing your way, the courage to say, I do not know who I am, but I am willing to find out. Ego disguised as divinity. How the good ones do the most harm. They smile with holy eyes, speak with polished virtue, and move through the world like messengers of light. But beneath the surface of their goodness, something festers, a quiet arrogance, a subtle violence disguised as compassion. These are not the wicked ones who know they sin. These are the good ones, the ones who believe they have transcended the animal, risen above their instincts, left behind the selfish, the savage, the dark. But in truth, they have only buried it, and what is buried does not die, it rots. Jung understood this terrifying paradox, that evil does not only wear the face of malice. Sometimes it wears a halo. Sometimes it quotes scripture, speaks of justice, preaches morality, and fights for the oppressed. Sometimes evil is so convinced of its righteousness that it can no longer recognize itself. And when the ego is cloaked in divinity, it becomes untouchable, immune to doubt, deaf to criticism, incapable of introspection. This is how the good ones do the most harm. Because when you are possessed by the idea that you are good, you no longer see the need to examine yourself. Your actions are justified by your identity. Your cruelty becomes necessary. Your rage becomes sacred. Your judgment becomes holy. And suddenly what would be called oppression in another is called justice in you. You punish in the name of healing. You shame in the name of truth. You destroy in the name of love. This is not goodness. This is the ego dressed in spiritual costume, wielding morality like a weapon to avoid its own shadow. And the terrifying part is, it doesn't know it's doing it. It truly believes it is helping, because it has mistaken its image for its essence. To be good is not to be without shadow. It is to know your shadow intimately, to wrestle with it, to integrate it, to own it so fully that it no longer needs to be projected onto others. But when people claim to be only love, only light, only positive, what they are really doing is amputating parts of themselves, banishing the uncomfortable truths of their own nature to the depths of the unconscious. And whatever is banished does not disappear. It waits, it grows, it gathers power, and eventually it returns, not as a whisper, but as a scream, as illness, as addiction, as sabotage, as the very behavior they claimed to stand against. This is why the truly dangerous person is not the one who knows they are broken. It is the one who believes they are whole. Not the one who owns their shadow, but the one who denies it, because that denial does not eliminate the shadow, it makes it autonomous. And once it is autonomous, it begins to act through them without their awareness. They think they are serving humanity, but they are serving the ego's hunger for control, recognition, superiority. The devil does not always come in the form of temptation. Sometimes it comes disguised as virtue. And the most seductive lie the ego ever tells is, "I am the light." Jung warned that no tree can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. Psychological growth demands descent. It demands confrontation with the inner darkness. But this is the path the good ones avoid. Instead, they ascend prematurely, inflate with spiritual bypassing, and float above their pain on clouds of affirmation and performance. They become addicted to the appearance of goodness, to the admiration it brings to the safety of being seen as pure. But nothing authentic can grow in the soil of denial. Without the compost of shadow, there is no depth, no humility, no transformation, only performance. A mask, a persona so polished, it begins to suffocate the soul beneath it. And the more they are praised for their light, the more terrified they become of their darkness. The more they are seen as healers, teachers, guides, the more pressure they feel to maintain the illusion of perfection. Until eventually, the mask fuses with the skin. They no longer know where the performance ends and the person begins. They speak of truth, but fear their own. They offer help, but cannot receive it. They proclaim unity, but divide. They serve others, but abandon themselves. They are caught in a tragic loop. The more they try to be good, the more shadow they create. Because they never stop to ask, what part of me have I rejected in order to be this? And that is the beginning of all unconscious harm, the exile of the inner truth for the sake of outer approval, the war against the inner beast for the illusion of sainthood. But you cannot amputate your darkness without losing your humanity. You cannot kill the dragon without killing the fire that could have warmed you, and every archetype within you contains both danger and gift. The tyrant holds the key to sovereignty, the seducer to connection, the shadow to vitality, and the ego's refusal to see. This is not enlightenment. It is inflation. It is blindness. It is a house of mirrors that shows only what flatters and hides what wounds. But you cannot heal what you will not face. So the question is not, are you good? The question is, are you whole? Are you willing to see yourself not just the light, but the lies, the envy, the rage, the fear, the manipulations masked as kindness? Are you willing to admit that sometimes your help is control in disguise? That sometimes your forgiveness is superiority? That your morality may be more about ego than ethics? Because that is where the real work begins, not in striving to be good, but in stripping away every lie you've told yourself about what goodness means, in daring to descend into the muck of your own soul and touch the places you've condemned in others. That is where healing happens. That is where the self begins to awaken, not in the light you broadcast to the world, but in the shadow you are finally willing to embrace. Archetypal possession. When you're no longer yourself, there comes a moment, often so subtle it slips beneath awareness, when you are no longer the one steering the vessel of your life. You speak, but the voice is not yours. You act, but the will behind the movement feels foreign. Something ancient has stepped into your skin, something older than culture, older than your name, older than the mask you wear in the daylight. This is not madness. It is archetypal possession, the terrifying moment when the psyche is overtaken by a force so vast, so impersonal, so godlike, that the ego is eclipsed. Jung did not speak lightly of this. He knew that beneath the fragile surface of personality lies a realm where the gods of myth still breathe, where the archetypes slumber in the dark waters of the collective unconscious, waiting. not to be understood, but to be lived through you. And when they awaken, they do not knock. They do not ask permission. They enter like a storm, like a lover, like a tyrant, consuming everything you thought you were. You become the warrior, even if you never chose the battle. You become the martyr, even if you never believed in sacrifice. You become the trickster, the lover, the tyrant, the fool. Your identity becomes a stage for ancient patterns to reenact themselves endlessly. This is not metaphor. It is myth made flesh. Archetypal possession is not when you play a role. It is when the role plays you. When you are overtaken by an energy so overwhelming, so intoxicating, it feels divine. And yet, in its wake, you are hollow, lost, disoriented. Because while the archetype lends you power, it takes your center in return. It offers you purpose, but steals your reflection. You can inspire, command, seduce, but at the cost of forgetting who you are beneath the mask. This is why Jung said that the greatest danger to the soul is to identify with the archetype. Because the archetype is not personal. It is eternal. It does not care for your individuality. It does not honor your story. It demands to be expressed, not understood. And when it finds an open vessel, a psyche unmoored, an ego inflated, a wound unhealed, it enters and takes over. Suddenly, your anger is no longer yours. It is the rage of the ancient warrior. Your desire is no longer personal. It is Aphrodite's hunger. Your obsession is no longer neurotic. It is the possession of the sorcerer, the prophet, the damned. You are not broken. You are inhabited. This is what the modern world does not understand. We speak of vibes, of energy, of archetypes as tools to be used. But the unconscious is not a toolkit. It is a realm, a sacred, terrifying landscape, where the line between self and symbol blurs. And when you descend into it, without guidance, without preparation, without reverence, you risk being devoured. This is not a metaphor. This is psychic reality. To open the gate to the unconscious is to invite the gods back into the soul. And if you are not grounded in yourself, if you have not built the inner vessel strong enough to contain the fire, they will burn you from the inside out. So many who walk the path of awakening confuse possession for transformation. They channel the archetype and believe they have become enlightened, and they mistake the influx of power for inner mastery. But power is not the proof of integration. Power is the test. And those who are possessed by an archetype always have the same symptoms. They are inflamed with certainty. They are obsessed with their role. They lose the capacity for nuance. They begin to orbit a single identity: the healer, the savior, the warrior, the lover, the revolutionary. They speak in absolutes. They polarize. They become agents of fate rather than stewards of consciousness. And worst of all, they cannot see it, because possession blinds you. It removes your capacity to observe yourself, to reflect, to doubt. And without that sacred distance, without the ability to witness your own myth playing out, you cannot individuate. You cannot become whole. You are merely a pawn on the board of the unconscious, reenacting patterns older than civilization, mistaking intensity for truth. And yet, even this is part of the journey. For to know the self, you must first lose yourself. To find the center, you must be thrown into the chaos. To be reborn, you must first be possessed. But possession is not the end, it is the threshold. The crossing into the underworld. The moment when you realize that you are not just one person. You are a theater of archetypes, a cathedral of forces, a vessel for the mythic. And when you wake up inside that realization, when you finally see the role for what it is, not who you are, but what moves through you, you begin to reclaim your soul. You begin the sacred work of depossession, of integration, of returning the archetype to its rightful place, not as your identity, but as your guide, not as your mask, but as your mirror. This is the task of inner alchemy: to hold the archetype without being devoured by it, to dance with the gods without mistaking yourself for one, to channel the warrior but not become addicted to the fight, to embody the healer but not sacrifice your truth, to feel the trickster rise in you but not lose yourself in chaos. This is what it means to individuate, not to become pure, but to become whole. Not to destroy the archetype, but to serve it consciously, to let it move through you like breath, like fire, like poetry, but always in dialogue with your soul, not as its master, not as its victim, but as its sacred witness. You're not who you think you are, and that's the problem. You wear a name, carry a past, speak from a history you didn't entirely choose, and call it me. But what if I told you this self, the one you defend, present, and perform, is not who you truly are? What if the person you think you are is a mask, not a lie, but a necessary illusion, a fragile construction pieced together from memories, roles, reactions, and rewards? You were taught to answer to it, to protect it, to build upon it. But this identity, this ego, is not the self. It is the surface. And the deeper you cling to the surface, the further you drift from the depths. Carl Jung understood this haunting truth that the greatest barrier to who we are is who we believe we are. Because the psyche is not a mirror. It is a labyrinth, and most never dare to leave the well-lit corridor of their reflection. You think you are your thoughts, but thoughts pass like clouds. You think you are your story, but stories are told 1,000 different ways. You think you are your choices, but most of them were shaped by wounds, by fear, by the hunger to belong. So who are you really beneath the scaffolding? Beneath the persona, the mask worn for the world's approval? Who are you when there is no one left to impress? No role to play? No applause to chase? The truth is, you don't know. And that's not a flaw. That's the beginning. Because the real journey doesn't begin with certainty. It begins with unknowing, with the shattering realization that the self you've curated is not the self you must become. The persona is a survival strategy, a costume woven from culture, family expectations, and fear. It helps you navigate the social world. It keeps you from being devoured by the tribe. But it comes at a cost. Every mask hides a wound. Every adaptation suppresses a truth. And over time, you begin to confuse the mask for the face beneath it. You say yes when your soul screams no. You laugh when you long to cry. You perform strength while quietly drowning. This is the tragedy of modern identity. We are praised for our performance and punished for our authenticity. And so we become hollowed versions of ourselves, echoes of the truth, polished shells carrying ancient pain. But the unconscious does not forget. It holds every unlived truth, every silenced scream, every repressed desire, like sacred relics buried in shadow. It dreams in symbols, it speaks in synchronicity. It sends you visions, triggers strange obsessions, not to torment you, but to awaken you, to call you back to the self you abandoned in the pursuit of belonging. Because you were not born to be liked, you were not born to be good, you were born to be whole. And wholeness requires the death of the false self, the collapse of the persona, the willingness to descend into the underworld of the psyche and retrieve the parts of you that were left behind. This descent is not glamorous. It does not yield social reward. It is lonely, humbling, terrifying, because it demands that you dismantle everything you thought made you valuable. It strips away your titles, your charm, your identity as a parent, lover, friend, thinker, leader. It demands that you meet yourself in the nakedness of your own psyche, without defense, without narrative, without excuse. And there, in the stillness of that psychological graveyard, something strange happens. You begin to hear the voice beneath the voice. The one you've ignored for years, the one that does not shout it, whispers, it does not flatter it, confronts, it does not demand it, invites. This is the voice of the self, the ancient, eternal core of your being that has never been wounded, never been praised, never been seen by the world. It is not who you are in public. It is who you are in silence. It is the root system beneath the identity tree. And it does not want performance. It wants truth, integration, wholeness. The self is not here to make you better. It's here to make you real. And the journey toward it is not a straight line. It is a spiral, a series of deaths and rebirths, confrontations and releases. Each time you let go of a false identity, you descend deeper. Each time you face your shadow, you return with more of your soul. The ego resists this. It clings to what it knows. It fears annihilation. And in a sense, it's right. Because to awaken is to die. To shed the skin of who you thought you were, who they told you you had to be, who you needed to be, to feel safe, wanted, relevant. But the death of the ego is not the end. It is the door through which the self emerges not as an idea, but as a living reality. And once you taste that reality, once you remember who you were before the world told you who to be, nothing else will satisfy. No title, no performance, no praise, because the hunger of the soul is not for success. It is for integration, for union, for truth, and that truth lives in your depths. In the shadow you've spent your life avoiding, in the dreams that disturb you, in the feelings that embarrass you, in the longings you deny, in the rage you suppress, in the wounds you hide. But if you are brave enough to descend, if you can face the dragon that guards your forgotten self, you will find that you are not broken. You are simply incomplete. The pieces are all there, waiting, longing, whispering through the cracks in your persona, daring you to remember. You are not who you think you are. You are so much more. And the moment you stop trying to be someone is the moment you begin to become yourself. How the persona kills the self. One smile at a time. You smile, not because you're at peace, but because it's expected. You say you're fine even as your soul withers. You laugh in crowds and cry in silence. You perform ease while drowning in complexity. This is the price of the persona. The mask we wear to be loved, accepted, admired. It begins innocently enough. A child notices what earns praise, what keeps the peace, what draws affection. Slowly, unconsciously, a false self is stitched together. Not to deceive others, but to survive them. Not to lie, but to be safe. And so, piece by piece, the real is replaced by the rehearsed, the raw by the refined, until the smile becomes your armor and the armor becomes your prison. Jung called this the persona, the social face, the mask of adaptation. It is necessary, but when it is mistaken for the self, it becomes a silent assassin, killing you gently, one smile at a time. The persona is not evil. It is a function of the psyche, a necessary interface between the soul and society. But it was never meant to be your identity. It was meant to be a tool. Like clothing, it serves a purpose, but it is not your skin. And yet we become trapped in the persona because the world rewards the mask more than the face beneath it. Vulnerability is punished. Authenticity is uncomfortable. Truth is often too heavy to carry into polite conversation, so we smile, we nod, we shrink. We polish our edges and rehearse our lines. We become acceptable at the cost of becoming whole. And the tragedy is no one sees the prison because from the outside, it looks beautiful. Productive, charming, successful. But inside the self suffocates, starved of truth, buried under years of performance, forgotten behind the echo of its own silence. You see it in the eyes of people who have everything and feel nothing. In the lives that look perfect but ache with emptiness. In the relationships that sparkle on the surface but rot beneath, because when you trade your truth for approval, you may gain the world, but you lose your soul. And no amount of applause can replace what is missing. The persona is a master of appearances, but it cannot feel. It cannot grieve. It cannot rage or yearn or tremble in awe. It can only mimic. And the more you identify with it, the more your inner life becomes a performance rather than a presence. You begin to smile without joy, speak without voice, exist without being. And the terrifying part is you may not even notice. Because the mask grows so slowly, so subtly, it becomes second skin. But deep in the psyche, the self remembers. It remembers the dreams you abandoned to be practical, the desires you repressed to be acceptable, the questions you silenced to be certain. It waits in the shadows, patient but restless, calling to you through the cracks in your facade. Through anxiety, through exhaustion, through sudden tears that make no sense, through the emptiness that follows your greatest accomplishments. The self does not speak in logic, it speaks in longing. In the ache behind your laughter, in the numbness behind your busyness, in the quiet despair that visits you in the middle of success. It is not trying to sabotage your life. It is trying to reclaim it. But to answer that call, you must commit a kind of treason. You must betray the image. You must risk being misunderstood, unloved, even abandoned, not because you wish to destroy connection, but because no real connection can grow where you are not real. You must take off the mask, not to reveal a perfect self beneath, but to rediscover the wild, unedited truth of who you are. The broken, the brilliant, the terrified, the divine. And that is where the journey begins, not when you learn how to pretend better, but when you finally refuse to pretend at all. When you stop asking, what do they want me to be, and start asking, what is it that I can no longer afford to deny? This is the work of individuation, to strip away the persona until what remains is not a role, but a presence, not an act, but a soul. This is not a one-time decision. It is a daily death, a moment-by-moment choice. To stand naked in a world obsessed with costumes, to risk rejection for the sake of honesty. To face the grief of all the years you abandoned yourself, and to do so not with blame, but with compassion. Because you were only trying to survive, and survival requires masks, but healing requires truth, and truth is not clean. It is messy, awkward, unpolished. It trembles, it bleeds, but it is alive. And only what is alive can be transformed. So take off the smile that isn't yours. Let your silence speak. Let your sadness breathe. Let your rage rise, not to destroy, but to reveal the fire that still burns in you. Let the part of you that has been waiting finally speak. The part that doesn't care how it looks, the part that is not strategic, not diplomatic, not pleasing, the part that is, because the self is not interested in your reputation, it is interested in your freedom, and the persona, no matter how convincing, can never set you free. Only truth can, and truth begins with one brave act, to no longer betray yourself in order to be seen. Why some people feel empty, behind their eyes. You've seen them. They walk among us with polished words, curated lives, and effortless smiles. But when you look into their eyes, something's missing. There's no spark, no depth, no presence. Just a haunting stillness, like a room beautifully decorated, but long abandoned. These are the hollow ones. Not evil, not cruel, just empty, as if the soul has gone silent. And what remains is a shell animated by duty, expectation, or performance. Jung would say the self has receded into the shadows, withdrawn not out of spite, but because the mask has taken over. The persona has become too thick, too convincing, too adored by the world. And where the mask is worshipped, the soul is starved. The emptiness behind the eyes is not a flaw. It's a symptom, a sign that something vital has been exiled from the center of being, that the person you're looking at is no longer in deep conversation with their own unconscious. They are living outwardly, but inwardly, they are missing. The world applauds the exterior. It rewards the roles, the resumes, the achievements. But the soul does not speak in these currencies. The soul speaks in symbols, in dreams, in longing. And when we stop listening, when we betray our deeper knowing to conform to succeed, to be liked, a silent erosion begins. It's not immediate. It happens slowly, like water wearing away at stone. A small compromise here, a silenced truth there, until one day they look in the mirror and see a face they recognize, but a presence they don't. This is the tragedy of disconnection. Not from others, but from one's own self, because when you are no longer anchored within your eyes, become windows to a house that no longer feels like home. And yet the world cannot see this because the exterior continues to function. They show up, they smile, they succeed. But they are not there. Not in the way that matters. Their joy is manufactured, their confidence rehearsed, their intimacy surface level. They touch, but they do not feel. They speak, but something else is speaking through them. A script, a role, a persona optimized for survival, but void of spirit. And this isn't just sadness, it's existential starvation. Because the self is not nourished by validation, it is nourished by truth. And truth, when ignored, for long enough retreats into the unconscious. It doesn't leave entirely. It just stops trying to speak through a mouth that's too busy lying. Jung saw this emptiness as a crisis of soul, a psychic famine created not by failure, but by the appearance of success without authenticity, by a life shaped entirely from the outside in, and no amount of outer achievement can fill an inner void. Because the void isn't asking for more, it's asking for meaning, for connection to something real, something archetypal, something eternal. The emptiness is not a deficiency. It is a calling, a sacred ache that says something essential is missing. Something sacred has been forgotten. Come back to yourself. But returning to the self requires descent, not into the spotlight, but into the shadows, into the rejected emotions, the unlived dreams, the inconvenient truths, into the parts of the psyche we've been taught to fear. And this is why so many stay empty, because fullness demands the confrontation of pain. Wholeness demands the death of the image, the death of who we pretended to be in order to be safe. And death, even the symbolic kind, is terrifying. But what we do not realize is that this fear is the gate. And behind it is not destruction, but resurrection, not loss, but liberation. The emptiness behind the eyes is not the end of the story. It is the silence before the soul begins to speak again. Because the self is always speaking, even in the hollowness, especially in the hollowness. In the moments when everything looks perfect but feels dead, in the subtle grief that follows every false success, in the gnawing restlessness beneath the laughter. That is the self knocking not to be praised, not to be fixed, but to be remembered, to be let in. And to do that, we must make room. We must empty the performance. Dismantle the persona. Let the curated version of us die, so something true can rise. This is the heart of individuation, not becoming better, but becoming real. Becoming rooted in your own depths, even if they scare you. Especially if they scare you, because only what is faced can be transformed. The eyes are not empty because there's nothing there. They're empty because there's too much that has been buried, too many words unsaid, too many dreams deferred, too many truths denied. But the soul does not give up. It waits. It waits for the day you're tired enough of pretending. It waits for the crack in the mask. It waits for the moment you finally say, "I want to feel again, even if it hurts." And that's when the journey begins. Not with a plan, not with a goal, but with a sacred trembling. Yes, a yes to the unknown, to the descent, to the unraveling of everything false in you. That is where the fullness returns, not all at once, but breath by breath, truth by truth, until one day someone looks into your eyes and sees you, not the version you've sold to the world, but the soul that survived beneath it all. Why some people feel empty behind their eyes. You've seen them. They walk among us with polished words, curated lives, and effortless smiles. But when you look into their eyes, something's missing. There's no spark, no depth, no presence. Just a haunting stillness, like a room beautifully decorated, but long abandoned. These are the hollow ones. Not evil, not cruel. Just empty. As if the soul has gone silent, and what remains is a shell animated by duty, expectation, or performance. Jung would say the self has receded into the shadows, withdrawn not out of spite, but because the mask has taken over. The persona has become too thick, too convincing, too adored by the world. And where the mask is worshipped, the soul is starved. The emptiness behind the eyes is not a flaw. It's a symptom. A sign that something vital has been exiled from the center of being. That the person you're looking at is no longer in deep conversation with their own unconscious. They are living outwardly, but inwardly, they are missing. The world applauds the exterior. It rewards the roles, the resumes, the achievements. But the soul does not speak in these currencies. The soul speaks in symbols, in dreams, in longing. And when we stop listening, when we betray our deeper knowing to conform, to succeed, to be liked, a silent erosion begins. It's not immediate. It happens slowly, like water wearing away at stone. A small compromise here, a silenced truth there, until one day they look in the mirror and see a face they recognize, but a presence they don't. This is the tragedy of disconnection. Not from others, but from one's own self, because when you are no longer anchored within your eyes, become windows to a house that no longer feels like home. And yet, the world cannot see this because the exterior continues to function. They show up, they smile, they succeed, but they are not there. Not in the way that matters. Their joy is manufactured, their confidence rehearsed, their intimacy surface level. They touch, but they do not feel. They speak, but something else is speaking through them. A script, a role, a persona optimized for survival, but void of spirit. And this isn't just sadness, it's existential starvation. Because the self is not nourished by validation, it is nourished by truth, and truth, when ignored for long enough, retreats into the unconscious. It doesn't leave entirely. It just stops trying to speak through a mouth that's too busy lying. Jung saw this emptiness as a crisis of soul. A psychic famine created not by failure, but by the appearance of success without authenticity. By a life shaped entirely from the outside in. And no amount of outer achievement can fill an inner void, because the void isn't asking for more. It's asking for meaning, for connection to something real, something archetypal, something eternal. The emptiness is not a deficiency. It is a calling. A sacred ache that says something essential is missing. Something sacred has been forgotten. Come back to yourself, but returning to the self requires descent. Not into the spotlight, but into the shadows, into the rejected emotions, the unlived dreams, the inconvenient truths, into the parts of the psyche. We've been taught to fear. And this is why so many stay empty, because fullness demands the confrontation of pain. Wholeness demands the death of the image, the death of who we pretended to be in order to be safe. And death, even the symbolic kind, is terrifying. But what we do not realize is that this fear is the gate. And behind it is not destruction, but resurrection. Not loss, but liberation. The emptiness behind the eyes is not the end of the story. It is the silence before the soul begins to speak again. Because the self is always speaking, even in the hollowness, especially in the hollowness, in the moments when everything looks perfect but feels dead, in the subtle grief that follows every false success, in the gnawing restlessness beneath the laughter that is the self knocking not to be praised, not to be fixed, but to be remembered, to be let in. And to do that, we must make room. We must empty the performance, dismantle the persona. Let the curated version of us die so something true can rise. This is the heart of individuation, not becoming better, but becoming real. Becoming rooted in your own depths, even if they scare you, especially if they scare you. Because only what is faced can be transformed. The eyes are not empty because there's nothing there. They're empty because there's too much that has been buried, too many words unsaid, too many dreams deferred, too many truths denied. But the soul does not give up. It waits. It waits for the day you're tired enough of pretending. It waits for the crack in the mask. It waits for the moment you finally say, I want to feel again, even if it hurts. And that's when the journey begins. Not with a plan, not with a goal, but with a sacred trembling yes, a yes to the unknown, to the descent, to the unraveling of everything false in you. That is where the fullness returns, not all at once, but breath by breath, truth by truth, until one day someone looks into your eyes and sees you. Not the version you've sold to the world, but the soul that survived beneath it all.